I have been wondering for a while now, what is the best pack to buy in Hearthstone? Some people say Kobolds and Catacombs, others Knights of the Frozen Throne. I want a definitive answer though, and if no one has one, I'm gonna find out for myself. Join me on the quest to find the best pack in Hearthstone. Okay, so here's how we're gonna find out which pack is objectively the best. I am gonna be going through every single card in an expansion, and rate them either a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3. We're going to be rating each card based off their overall power level and relevance to the wild meta as a whole. Cards that get a 0 can either be straight up bad, outclassed, too niche to be relevant, or have just never been relevant and will never be relevant. Cards that score a 1 are technically not bad, but just aren't strong enough to really be big players in the meta and define the decks they're in, often just being fringe inclusions in the decks they are sometimes played in. Cards that get a rating of 2 are good. They may be staple inclusions across a certain class archetype, strong enough to spawn lesser played decks built directly around them, or just tech options you could choose to include in one of your decks that aren't necessary. Basically, all these cards are seen on a regular basis. Lastly, cards that get a score of 3 go above and beyond. They can be class-defining cards, cards that have always dominated the wild meta, or cards that just have the ability to slot into virtually any deck. Once we have rated every card, we will add up the scores for an expansion and compare them to each other. The pack that has the most total points in the end will be the winner. I know that some expansions have more or less cards, and that many sets also exist, but we will use the card set standard of 135, divide it by the amount of cards the expansion we're rating includes, and then multiply the final score an expansion receives by that amount. There are a few more expansion-specific discrepancies, but I'll sort them out when we go over their respective videos. Now, for the first video in the search, we will begin with the bottommost pack in the shop and work our way up. This means we'll be starting with the mech-filled expansion of Goblins vs. Gnomes. Let's start the ratings off with all the neutral cards. Starting with Clockwork Gnome, getting a 0. Cogmaster gets a 0. Enoyotron gets a 1. Explosive Sheep gets a 0. Gilblin Stalker gets a 0. Mech Warper gets a 1. Micro Machine gets a 0. Puddle Stomper gets a 0. Ship's Cannon gets a 2 as it's amazing in any pirate tech. Stone Splinter Trog gets a 0, Flying Machine gets a 1, Gnomergan Infantry actually gets a 1 as it's played in decks like Combo Inner Fire Priest. Ogre Brute gets a 0, Spider Tank gets a 0, Tinkertown Technician gets a 0, Burly Rockjaw Trog gets a 0, Lost Tall Strider gets a 0, Mechanical Yeti gets a 0, Piloted Shredder gets a 0, Anti-Keelbot gets a 1, it's technically not bad neutral healing, Salty Dog gets a 0, and Force Tank Max gets a 0. Onto the rares, Target Dummy gets a 1, it's played in decks like Cute Warlock. Gnomish Experimenter gets a 0, Goblin Sapper gets a 0, Illuminator gets a 0, Lil Exorcist gets a 0, Arcane Nullifier X21 gets a 0, Jeeves gets a 0, Kazan Mystic gets a 0, it's just too slow, Bomb Lobber gets a 0, Matter Bomber gets a 0, Recombo Bulator, whatever that card's called, gets a 0, Hobgoblin gets a 0, Mini Mage gets a 0, Enhancer Mechano gets a 0, Fel Reaver gets a 0, just play Ticketus and Warlock, Junkbot gets a 0, Piloted Sky Golem gets a 0, and Clockwork Giant gets a 0. Lastly, onto the neutral legendaries. Blingtron 3000 gets a 0, Hemet Nessingberry gets a 0, Mimron's Head gets a 0, Gazlo gets a 0, Mogre the Ogre gets a 0, Toshli gets a 0, Dr. 7 gets a 0, Trogzor the Earthinator gets a 0, Faux Reaper 4000 gets a 0, Sneed's Old Shredder gets a 0, and Mechshaneer Thermal Plug gets a 0. Starting with the class cards now, Druid. Anodized Robocub gets a 0, Druid of the Fang gets a 0, Grove Tender gets a 0, Mech Bear Cat gets a 0, Recycle gets a 0, Dark Whispers gets a 0, Tree of Life gets a 0, Malorn gets a 0. Hunter next, with Glidezuka getting a 0, Cobra Shot gets a 0, Call Pet gets a 0, Metal-Tooth Leaper gets a 0, King of Beasts gets a 0, Vain Death gets a 2 as it's great in Death Rattle Hunter decks. Steam Weedle Sniper gets a 1 as you can play it in Even Hunter. And Gazrilla gets a 0. Starting with Mage, we have Flame Cannon, which gets a 0, Snow Chugger, which gets a 0, Unstable Portal, which gets a 0, Suit Spewer, which gets a 0, Goblin Blast Mage gets a 0, Echo of Medivh gets a 0, Wheeze Spell Stomper gets a 0, and Flame Leviathan gets a fat 0. Paladins next, with Seal of Light, which gets a 0, Shield of Minibot gets a 2 as it's an amazing 2-drop, Muster for Battle gets a 2 as it's a great card and is always seen play in Odd Paladin, Scarlet Purifier gets a 0, Cobalt Guardian gets a 0, Cog Hammer gets a 0, Quartermaster gets a 2, again carrying Odd Paladin, and Bolver gets a 0. We have Priest now, starting with Shrinkmeister, it gets a 0, Velen's Chosen, which gets a 0, Light of the Naru gets a 0, Shadow Boxer gets a 0, Upgraded Repairbot gets a 0, Shadow Bomber gets a 0, Light Bomb gets a 0, and Vol'jin gets a 0. Onto Rogue, Goblin Autobarber gets a 0, Tinker's Sharpsword Oil gets a 2, One-Eyed Cheat gets a 0, Iron Sensei gets a 0, Ogre Ninja gets a 0, Cog Master's Wrench gets a 0, Sabotage gets a 0, Trade Prince Gallywix gets a 0. Onto Shaman. Crackle gets a 0, Whirling Zap-O-Matic gets a 0, Vitality Totem gets a 0, Power Mace gets a 0, Dune Maul Shaman gets a 0, Ancestress Call gets a 1, Siltsfin Spirit Walker gets a 0, Neptulon gets a 0. With the Warlock now, Dark Bomb gets a 0, Floating Watcher gets a 0, Queen of Pain gets a 0, Fell Cannon gets a 0, Implosion gets a 0, Demon Heart gets a 0, Anima Golem gets a 0, and Mal'Ganis gets a 3. Lastly, Warrior. We have Warbot, which gets a 0, Ogre Warmaul, which gets a 0, Screwdrank Clunker gets a 0, Shield Maiden gets a 0, it's just way too slow, Siege Engine gets a 0, Bouncing Blade gets a 0, Crush gets a 0, and lastly, Iron Juggernaut gets a 0. So, since the neutral cards scored a total of 8 points, and the class cards scored a total of 15, we'll add them together to get 23 points. Since Goblins vs. Gnomes only has a total of 123 cards you can open, we will take the standard amount of cards an expansion has, which is 135, divide it by 123, and multiply our card score by that amount. Goblins vs. Gnomes overall scores a measly 25 points based on our ranking system. Since it is the first pack we've covered, it's currently the best pack to buy, as it has the most total points. But once we start covering a few more expansions, I expect it to drop down the ranks pretty quickly. Okay, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions towards this video series, please let me know in the comments below. I will take all your comments into consideration when the next video comes out, hopefully like 2 weeks from now. That's all. Zdude out.